I lived peacefully next to a beautiful creek until the damn HOA decided to drain it, claiming it was a danger to children, and there were no children in that area. But what they didn't expect was that I had an even better plan. You know that feeling of finally having found your corner of the world, the place where you can take a deep breath, sip your coffee, listening to the birds, and simply exist without anyone crowding you? Well, I thought I'd found that when I bought my property. A perfect piece of land, with a stream running through the bottom of my yard. The sound of running water was the best free therapy in the world. But of course, life has a special talent for throwing problems in our faces when we least expect it. And my problem had a name. I mean, technically, she had a name, but I just called her the Demon in the Beige Blazer. This woman was the queen of the Homeowners Association, the notorious HOA, a bunch of idle people who think they can run other people's lives just because they live in the same neighborhood. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought I'd just be another one of those neighbors who complains if you paint the fence a color that's not in the community handbook. But no, she was a completely different level of walking nightmare. It started with notes in my mailbox, little notices about how my yard could be more in line with neighborhood standards. Then came the meetings I never asked to attend, where they discussed absurd things like the permitted height of lawns and the acceptable shade for curtains. But the final straw came when I arrived home to find a team of workers draining my creek. Yes, you read that right. They were there, hoses and pumps on, sucking every drop of water out of the stream as if it were a crime for me to have a piece of nature in my backyard. My mind short-circuited. It was so angry that it took me a minute not to just shove one of the hoses into the woman's mouth and tell her to drink all that water back. I went straight to her, who was standing there with her arms crossed, with that damn satisfied smile of someone who has just ruined someone's day. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked, trying to maintain a modicum of civility. And then came the most absurd justification I've ever heard. "We're draining because an unauthorized stream could pose a danger to children in the neighborhood." Let's ignore the fact that no one in that damn neighborhood had small children. As far as I knew, the youngest person there must have been about 45 years old and had a deep hatred of any human being under 20. But no, according to the HOA, the creek was an imminent danger to all the invisible little children in the neighborhood. I tried to argue. I tried to explain that that stream had always been there, that it was a natural resource, and that no one had ever had a problem with it. But it was no use. For her, it all came down to one thing: control. These HOA people live to boss others around. It's not about safety. It's not about rules. It's about the power to meddle in other people's lives and to do so with a satisfied smile. In less than a day, my creek turned into a dry hole. Where once there had been a patch of peace, there was now a pile of cracked earth and a horrible smell of exposed mud. My little natural paradise had been transformed into nothing. Should I accept it? Let it go? Conform? And move on as any rational person would? If she wanted war, then war she would have. And I promised myself that when I was done, she would miss that water so much that she would drown in her own arrogance. After that woman drained my stream without warning, without consultation, and without a shred of common sense, I stood there looking at the damage. The earth was cracked. The previously submerged stones were now thrown about as if someone had emptied a giant bathtub without worrying about the mess. The smell was a mixture of dried mud and accumulated anger. And the worst thing? The woman still had the audacity to walk down my sidewalk the next day with that superior air, as if she had done humanity a favor. "Now your property is safer," she said, as if thanking me for something I never asked for. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth, but I took a deep breath. Pure rage rarely solves problems. Ruthless and meticulous planning does. And that's how I started my plan. First, I spent some time observing. If that woman and her HOA goons were so concerned about safety, then I should understand the neighborhood the way they saw it. I walked around the neighborhood discreetly, noticing every little detail that could be used against them. And that's when I discovered something very, very interesting. Most of the HOA's houses were in a slightly lower area than my property. This meant that if an absurd amount of water happened to come out of nowhere, it would flow directly into their backyards. It was the kind of thing that made me laugh alone in the middle of the night. I spent the next few weeks doing some work in my yard. Of course, discreetly. After all, if anyone saw me with shovels and pipes in the middle of the night, they'd start to get suspicious. But nothing that good planning and a few cans of beer to disguise it as a gardening project couldn't solve. The first step was to dig a new channel. Not exactly in the same place as the old stream. That would be too obvious, but close enough so that, when everything was ready, the flow of water could be controlled and directed wherever I wanted. The second step was the reservoir. That part was brilliant. A beautiful rainwater harvesting system with some very well-placed pumps. Every drop that fell in my yard was stored there, waiting for the right moment. And then, when the structure was complete, came the final stage of the plan, the Great Deluge. It rained for days, and I smiled with every drop that fell, because I knew that when the rain stopped, the HOA would have a much bigger problem than a stream that was dangerous for imaginary children. The woman, of course, continued to parade around the neighborhood as if she owned everything. You could see her satisfaction every time she passed my dry yard, as if she had won a war that shouldn't have started. But the problem with people who think they're too smart is that they never realize when they're about to fall flat on their faces. One fine evening, when everything was strategically full, I opened the floodgates. Not literally, because I'm not a cartoon villain, but that's what it felt like. The pumps did their job, and all that accumulated water found a new destination. First came the strangeness. Neighbors began to notice that the lawns were wetter than usual. Some people thought the irrigation system had broken down. Others thought that the recent rain was still draining. But as the days passed and the water didn't go away, the HOA's smiles turned to worried looks. Then came despair. The water found its way into the backyards, then into the perfectly maintained flower beds, then to the newly installed wooden decks, and finally into the foundations of the houses. Panic set in when they realized that the water simply had nowhere to go. The woman was the last to notice, because, of course, she lived in the largest house in the HOA, which was a little higher than the others. But when she saw that her backyard was starting to turn into a makeshift pond, she ran to the other members, demanding answers. But nobody knew anything. They called in plumbers, geologists, engineers, anyone who could explain why the hell the neighborhood was turning into a swamp. And me? Oh, I just sat on the balcony, sipping my coffee and admiring the view. What I did wasn't illegal. Not that I cared much about it, but technically, I just channeled the water the way nature already wanted. If I couldn't have a stream, then no one else would have a dry yard. And best of all, they couldn't just drain it again. This time, it was permanent. But this story isn't over yet, because the HOA, as always, didn't know when to give up. And when they realized they were sinking, literally, they decided to try to blame me. And that's when it got even funnier. It really started to get interesting when the HOA realized that the water wasn't going away. Because, until then, they were still in that denial phase, thinking that a day or two of sunshine would solve the problem. But when the days passed, and instead of drying out, the yard sank, that's when the real chaos began. And the woman? Oh, she had already gone into full dictator mode. She walked around the neighborhood like a general inspecting defeated troops, trying to hold her pose while the wooden floor of her balcony swelled with moisture and the walls began to show suspicious patches of mold. Her panic was palpable, but her arrogance wouldn't let her admit that perhaps she was facing something she couldn't control. The HOA meetings, which had previously only served to decide whether the color of the gates was acceptable, suddenly turned into sessions of collective despair. Everyone wanted answers, and, as expected, The woman soon found a perfect scapegoat, me. Because, of course, who else would be to blame? After all, it couldn't be their fault for draining a stream that had existed there for years. It couldn't be their fault for changing the hydrology of the neighborhood without consulting anyone. No, it had to be my fault. Then, one fine day, while I was quietly mowing the lawn, yes, my lawn was still impeccable, unlike the mud where the others had to tread, the woman showed up with 2 other HOA members, armed with clipboards and unfriendly faces. "We need to talk," she said, with that tone of voice of an HR boss, about to fire someone. I continued mowing the lawn, very slowly, just to savor the moment. "Talk about what?" I asked, without looking at her. "About the drainage problem you caused." "Oh, so that's how you were going to play the game?" I put the cutter away, wiped my hands on my pants, and looked at the trio as if they were bad actors rehearsing a scene that nobody wanted to watch. "And how exactly did I cause this?" I asked, crossing my arms. The woman consulted her clipboard as if she had a complete dossier against me. "Ever since we drained the stream, the water situation has gotten out of control, and we know that you made modifications." She said the last word as if she were accusing me of arms smuggling. "Modifications? You mean gardening?" She narrowed her eyes. "We know that you changed the flow of water, and now, because of these irresponsible actions, several houses are experiencing serious flooding problems." I blinked, feigning shock. "Wow, that's terrible. You mean messing with a natural ecosystem without understanding the consequences can result in unexpected disasters? Who would have thought it?" The 2 idiots next to her looked at each other. They weren't very bright, I could tell. The woman, however, kept her focus. "That doesn't change the fact that we need you to solve this problem." Ah, that was the best part. She thought she could intimidate me, that I would give in, that I would bend to her will like all the other idiots in that neighborhood. But what she didn't know was that I was having too much fun to stop now. "Solve it?" I asked, tilting my head. "And how exactly do you expect me to solve it?" She straightened her shoulders. "We want you to drain the water." I held back my laughter. "Of course, like you drained the stream, right? Because it worked so well last time." She ignored the sarcasm. "You have no choice," she said, crossing her arms. "If you don't do something, we'll have to file a lawsuit against you for damage to the HOA's property." And that's when I burst out laughing. Not a quiet laugh, but a loud, long, satisfied laugh. Because that was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. "Sue?" I asked, wiping away a tear from laughing so hard. "You want to sue me? Because the water followed gravity?" The silence was delicious. "I didn't change the geography of the neighborhood, you did. It wasn't me who tampered with a stream without permission. It was you. And now that nature is correcting the mess you made, it's my fault?" She opened her mouth, but I raised my hand. "Even better," I continued, already savoring the final blow. "If you want to go to court, I'd love to. Because then we can pull up the records of the drainage of the stream. You could involve the environmental agencies, maybe even the press. I bet the newspapers would love a story like that. HOA destroys creek and causes ecological disaster." The silence became deafening. The 2 wax figures next to her began to sweat. The woman realized she had entered a game she couldn't win. But, as expected, she didn't give up easily. "We can come to an agreement," she said, trying to play the diplomat. I pretended to think for a moment. Let me see. "No." Her face turned red. "Are you refusing to help the community?" "Ille, yen. I'm helping nature deal with the consequences of your stupidity." She gave me a glare, turned around and stomped off, the other 2 running after her like disoriented ducklings. But I knew it wasn't over yet, because when someone like that woman realizes she's lost, she doesn't accept defeat. She only does one thing. She tries again, and worse. And I was ready for her next move. I knew that woman wasn't going to accept defeat. She might have stomped off my property, but deep down, she must have been seething with hatred at having been defeated in front of her henchmen. People like her don't know how to lose. For them, any setback becomes a personal mission of revenge. And, as expected, she tried one last blow. The following week, while I was enjoying the view from my yard, which, unlike the rest of the neighborhood, wasn't sinking, a black car pulled up in my driveway. A man in a suit got out, with that "you already know why I'm here" expression. Obvious. The HOA decided to call in the lawyers. "Do you own this property?" he asked, trying to look authoritative. "No, I'm just here to steal Wi-Fi," I replied, feigning curiosity. He snorted, with no patience for jokes. "My name is Douglas Simmons. I represent the Residents Association of this community, and I'm here to officially notify you that legal action may be taken against you due to the recent complications caused by the change in water flow on your property." I held back my laughter. "So, you mean the HOA thinks gravity is my fault?" He pressed his lips together, with no patience for irony. "The issue isn't gravity, sir. The issue is that your property was modified in an irresponsible manner, causing significant impacts on the surrounding residences." I crossed my arms, feigning consideration. I get it. Just ask me one question. Have you called an engineer to confirm this?" Silence. Of course they hadn't. Because if you called a real expert, you'd find out that the problem was caused when you drained the stream, the same stream that had always kept the soil moisture balanced and prevented rainwater from accumulating in the low points of the neighborhood. I carried on. "Because, you see, what it looks like to me here is that the HOA destroyed a natural resource without thinking about the consequences, and now it's trying to blame the wrong person." The lawyer tried to keep his composure, but you could tell he knew it was true. "The point, sir, is that there is a problem, and we need to find a solution." "Good," I clapped my hands. "Then let's solve it the right way." Before he had time to recover, I pulled out an envelope and handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. "An environmental impact report that I hired an engineer to do. It confirms that the problem has nothing to do with my property. In fact, it points to the illegal drainage of the stream as the real cause of the flooding." The lawyer flipped through the pages, his face becoming increasingly serious. But I haven't finished. "Oh, and here," I took out another envelope, "are the emails I sent to the town hall reporting the improper drainage of the stream." He took the papers and read them quickly. His expression turned grim when he saw the prefecture's reply. "Are they investigating this yet?" he muttered. "Yes, because you know what happens when you alter a body of water without permission. You can be fined, prosecuted, and forced to restore the stream to its original state." The lawyer went white. He knew it was serious, and he knew that the HOA didn't have a shred of argument to contest it. The icing on the cake? Oh, and lastly, I pulled a USB stick out of my pocket and handed it to him. "What's on here?" he asked, already looking defeated. "A video of the day they drained the stream. It clearly shows his client, yes, that woman, supervising everything, laughing and saying that this would finally bring order to the neighborhood. He was now officially unresponsive. The silence was so profound that I could hear the sound of a frog croaking in the HOA's new swamp. He closed his eyes for a second and sighed, knowing he had lost. "I'm going to need to discuss this with my client." "You do that," I said, smiling. "But I'm warning you right now that if I'm sued, I'm going to call the media, the environmental agencies, and turn this neighborhood into a newspaper headline." He nodded, knowing it was true. The next day, the HOA withdrew any mention of lawsuits against me. But it didn't end there. With the complaints made to City Hall and the evidence collected, that woman and her henchmen were prosecuted by the state. The fine? A hefty one. And the worst thing for them? The order to restore the stream. Ah, that was glorious. I sat on the veranda, sipping a cold lemonade, watching the same workers who drained my stream being forced to redo it. The woman? She was trying to keep her composure, but I could tell she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Her house? Still sinking, full of mold and with a compromised foundation. And me? My yard was intact. After months of fighting, revenge, and sheer incompetence on the part of the HOA, I finally got my comeuppance. The creek came back, the HOA was discredited, and the woman, well, they say she put the house up for sale. But nobody wants to buy a house in a swamp. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave your like and comment.